So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us at this rather grand building for this very important conference. My name is James Wharton. I'm the chair of the Office for Students, and it's my job to welcome you here and introduce the day from the next speaker onward. I think it should be an interesting but also an important series of speakers and discussions, and I hope that you will find it of use and of value. I know we've got quite a lot of people here in person. We've also got an awful lot of people who've signed up to tune in online in the way of the world these days. I think we have in the region of 800 people have signed up to attend or take part in this conference. That said, we know what these things are like, particularly online, and I'm sure that with our Director for Fair Access and Participation here, we'll be keeping a close eye on dropout rates to ensure that there's no unexpected surprises. But genuinely welcome everyone. I think it's a very important topic and an important opportunity to explore where, across the sector, we can work together to raise attainment, improve access, and secure success for students, whatever their background and whatever their ambition and opportunity. A little bit about the OFS. I understand that not everybody will know who we are. The Office for Students is the higher education regulator for England. When you think regulators, you may be familiar with some of the other government regulators, Ofgem, Ofsted, Ofwat, of course, which look after water. Well, OFS, we look after higher education. I sometimes think we should be called Ofsted to reflect the nomenclature of the other regulators, but nonetheless, that's where we are. And we're doing some very exciting work. We've seen some changes in the last few years. It's been difficult, I think, for all of us to deal with the pandemic and the new challenges that has represented. Nonetheless, the higher education sector has soldiered on through. There are some real signs of success. There have been some great examples of adaptability and innovation. At the same time, there is now much to do as we transition back to normal and we look to the future, because it is in all of our interests that those who have the potential to benefit from higher education are given every opportunity to do so. And it remains the case that too many young people who would and could benefit from access to higher education still don't find that that's an avenue that they consider to be available to them, or are still not made sufficiently aware of the breadth of opportunities that exist. And that's partly what today is about. We're here to explore how universities and colleges can work together with schools to raise attainment and improve opportunities, particularly for those disadvantaged students, for those groups, across that breadth of groups from which access and for which participation figures still remain all too low. The disparity between the attainment of pupils from more affluent backgrounds and those from disadvantaged groups remains quite staggering. They get fewer 2-1 or higher degrees, they have higher dropout rates. We know that many of these problems start as early as primary school, and it is only by working together right across the education environment that we can hope to tackle them and make a real difference. And it is therefore a great pleasure to see the range of speakers that we have here today, and to take this opportunity, I hope, to explore how we might tackle some of these challenges and improve the outcomes for so many, which is clearly it's an important part of what we do as the regulator, but I think it's an important part of what everybody here believes needs to be done by virtue of the fact that you're here and taking part, but also recognizing, as we all have, that there are many people out there who should have better opportunities and for some reason, for a variety of reasons, have not sometimes able to avail themselves of them. We have the potential to make a real difference, raising attainment right across the student life cycle, and we hope this will be an opportunity to share learning and experience, to consider the evidence of what really does work, and to improve our understanding in context of what we are all doing, of what different parts of the education sector are doing to address some of these challenges. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome particularly all of our speakers today. We have some excellent high-profile and informative speakers to contribute to this discussion. And it also then falls to me to do a little bit of housekeeping. And if it's all right, I will now refer to my notes so that I don't forget anything, because I will get in terrible trouble if I do. The first is that a little bit like being on an aeroplane, if people remember what that was like from years ago or can get through the queues at Heathrow, please pay attention, as this conference may differ from conferences that you have attended before. But fire evacuation is a two-tone klaxon. If the fire alarm sounds, please exit by the nearest fire exit. I suppose I'm supposed to do this and show you where it is. And please do not use the lifts. The event is being live streamed and recorded, but members of the audience will not be filmed. We're also live tweeting using the hashtag OFSInsight. So if you want to say nice things on Twitter, please use that hashtag. And if you want to say less nice things on Twitter, please don't. On your event program, you should find a QR code, which if you scan with your device, will link you to the insight brief that we have published today on schools, attainment, and the role of higher education. So we're very tech-savvy with Twitter, streaming, QR codes, and all sorts of things. And we've also published today an online guide for teachers and school leaders, which provides an introduction to the OFS, if you're not familiar with our work, and explores the issues we will be talking about today. I also want to recognise and encourage everyone, if you haven't already, those who are here in person, to visit the exhibition in the Great Hall. There are a lot of good stands, opportunities to have useful discussions and interesting things to take a look at there. You can also speak to some of our Uni Connect partnerships, which work specifically to increase the number of young people from disadvantaged groups going to university. And with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce your first and keynote speaker today, our Director for Fair Access and Participation, John Blake. John.
Thank you, James. And it falls to me to now wrench everyone's minds back from considering precisely what Ofsted would look like. Good morning to everyone, everyone joining us here in the hall and online from across the country. It's genuinely a delight to see so many friends and colleagues again here in person and have a chance to meet new ones too, after the challenges and misfortunes of the past 2 years. And I'm hugely proud that the first in-person OFS Insight event since the pandemic should be on an issue as crucial as school and higher education partnerships. Like many of us here, I've worked my entire life in education, and like all of us, I believe in the profound power of education to change lives. But the truth that all those of us who work in education understand is that such changes are rarely, if ever, the work of a single hand. In our mind's eye, we may most vividly recall a single great teacher, but the reality of education is that each new piece of learning builds on that which has gone before, and knowledge acquired at one moment in time may not click into place for a student until long after the teacher who shared it with them has moved on. The reception teacher patiently teaching a 5-year-old to identify the constituent phonemes of the English language, and the university lecturer exploring whether William Blake really did think the Industrial Revolution was a tiger burning bright, are a long way apart, but they are bound by a common endeavour. Yet the way we've built the education system of England does not necessarily support the recognition of that common purpose. We have too many hidden hierarchies between educational phases and within educational sectors, which have militated against systematically building the sort of meaningful partnerships between the different institutions of education which we need. That is not to say that we do not have examples of excellent and impactful practice in a wide variety of forms. There are universities which have founded multi-academy trusts to formalise their collaboration with schools, such as the University of Brighton Academy Trust, which runs 15 schools in Sussex and, says Ofsted, has school improvement at the heart of its work, including collaborative projects with the university. The University of Cambridge runs the Enrich Maths programme, providing learning resources to students across the age range and to their families. It has been used by schools and families in every part of the country, with 10 million visitors to its website in the last year alone. Kingston University and Royal Holloway University work closely with Reach Academy Feltham, providing valuable expertise and opportunities for children of all ages through both the Reach Children's Hub and the planned Feltham College. I think it is important that we take time to appreciate this work. Whilst no amount of work in the wider community can excuse a higher education provider who is not meeting our expectations on admissions and quality, it is only right that the OFS, as the regulator for HE, should acknowledge where universities are doing good work without caveat. Indeed, the mass variations process, where all HE providers currently holding an access and participation plan are asked to submit an update to their current plans, will be launching next week precisely to allow providers to capture the full scale of their work on our priority areas, such as school engagement, but also including successful participation, non-traditional pathways, and evaluation. And whilst it's important for the OFS to give credit where it is due to those we regulate, I discuss these examples also to challenge those who say universities cannot do this work. Universities are doing this work. So are specialist institutions, so are many colleges. I am not asking providers to conjure interventions in a barren field, but to share the work they are doing, consider how greater collaboration and stronger evaluation could help them do more, and for the sector as a whole to approach this issue strategically. Those examples also illustrate the importance of higher education providers working at different phases in education, not focusing only on those who are on the cusp of applying for HE. We expect providers to consider carefully what they can do to add value to the schools they partner with, and this will often be with students who are not approaching statutory assessment. Most schools are teaching GCSEs well. The school accountability system has rightly ensured that these crucial examinations are the strong focus of teachers' work. But in the past few years, schools have recognised the central role of curriculum and non-statutory assessment in improving outcomes. And Amanda Spielman, the Chief Inspector of Ofsted, who I'm delighted to say is joining us today, has refreshed the school inspection framework to focus on these issues much more closely. Where universities and colleges can support and innovate in these areas, they are likely to be making an effective difference, helping ensure that gaps in knowledge are identified and tackled before pupils reach Key Stage 4. Though I should acknowledge that to mention gaps in knowledge is to invite the challenge that focusing on attainment for students from disadvantaged backgrounds, especially with an eye to the mentoring university, is unfairly privileging one group's valued knowledge over another, undervaluing the insight and experiences of working-class kids, and forcing onto them the mores of a middle-class world they do not need and will not enjoy. As someone who was educated entirely at comprehensive state schools, and the first in my family to go to any university, and who spent the first night at that university eating dinner a table away from a load of people making jokes to each other in Latin, which I had to confess to not having, a verb I had never previously encountered in regard to languages, I get the argument. Bourgeois habitus can be alienating, is often ill-considered, and frequently deeply tedious. But whilst we absolutely should tear down artificial barriers to access based on accents, home lives, or the hobbies you've the time and resources to pursue, we also have to have some honest conversations about the variable levels of preparedness of students for higher education, and how to ensure that every student, wherever they're from and whenever in their life they apply, is in the best position to get every benefit they can from their one shot at state-subsidised undergraduate education. I recently had the chance to visit York and meet with the students and staff of all the HE providers in the city. One young woman spoke with beaming pride about the support she had given via one of York University's outreach programmes to a Year 7 pupil in one of York's schools. She was a mathematician and had been partnered with him to support him with multiplication. She explained why that student had been chosen for her. He didn't know his 2 times tables, she said, and no one should feel ashamed about that. No, I thought, he shouldn't feel ashamed about that. But as a society, we should. We should all be ashamed that too many young people cannot access the fundamentals of learning that are their right. It is right and proper to pull people out of the river when they are in difficulty, but at some point we ought to go upstream and find out why they are falling in. And doing that work not only removes a barrier for the individual concerned, it fundamentally alters the shape of the pipeline from school to university. The insight brief the OFS has released today demonstrates that the access gap between pupils in receipt of free school meals and those without is almost entirely explained by prior attainment. So whilst we absolutely must not make those who are learning feel ashamed, we cannot pretend that it does not matter whether students come to understand that knowledge. Because of course it does, both for the value of the knowledge itself and for the further knowledge that can be built upon it. And it is no kindness to those we teach to pretend otherwise. Of course, rather than eliminate the gap in attainment between pupils from different socioeconomic groups, Some will respond that we should instead eliminate differences between socioeconomic groups. Much as I might like to use the rest of this speech as the starting pistol for the revolution, I can't help but feel that that is perhaps not an entirely realistic approach. Whilst it is obviously the case that inequality in our society manifests in our education system, this is not a new phenomenon. It has been the case for as long as we've had an education system. And for much of that time, the gaps between socioeconomic groups were far larger than they are now. To say that until the government does more to tackle inequality, we in education cannot possibly be expected to achieve very much is brutally a bit like the teenager demanding to know why they should tidy their room when the world is in such a mess. It undervalues the great power of education. That is an intervention. It changes those who receive it, and those who provide it cannot, must not, abdicate that power in the face of the challenges of a divided society. To be fair, although I've heard those challenges since I started this job, I've also heard a great deal of positivity about this agenda. Higher education providers keen to see their wider civic work reflected in their access and participation plans. Widening participation charities reporting real enthusiasm for partnership where it had not been present before. New roles in evaluating access and participation appearing across the sector. That positive approach is what we must capitalise on. But precisely because education is a long chain of partnerships, so this work is unlikely to be best done in isolation. Instead, we need strong networks that can combine their impact to be far more powerful than any one actor alone. I've said this before, but I think it is crucial to repeat it. If we face long odds in making a difference to children's life chances, just demanding people work longer or harder isn't going to fix that. We are not short on people who will give up days, weeks, years of their time to pour into projects supporting the vulnerable and disadvantaged. We are not short on good suggestions, possible solutions, and rough ideas of how we could do things better. What we need is to build an ecosystem of evidence-based practice which fuses the learning of practitioners and the outcomes of rigorous evaluation to ensure that the most promising work is scaled up and improved, and the energies of the willing are expended where they can make the most difference. That ecosystem of evidence-based practice will encompass much more than attainment raising in schools. It will range across the full spectrum of work needed to ensure equality of opportunity in higher education. Because our insight brief today also reminds us that whilst improving attainment might make a huge difference to students from disadvantaged communities, it is not a silver bullet for all access issues. Eliminating gaps in attainment would bring us closer to parity between male and female students in access, for example, but doesn't take us all the way there. Attainment is crucial, and improving it is an essential step on the road to full equality of opportunity in higher education. But there will be more we have to do throughout students' journey through education to ensure that equality of opportunity is a reality for all learners. Expanding the agenda on school attainment cannot mean we are looking away from the access and participation work that must be undertaken once students have made it into HE. What we are helping young people access must also be made fit for them to succeed. They must be properly supported to experience all their provider has to offer without unfair barriers and go on to fulfilling lives and careers. But here too, the partnerships between schools and higher education providers can yield useful insights, as our colleagues from Princeton University will discuss later today. There is an urgency to any work to tackle disadvantage because we know how pernicious its effects can be. But rushed interventions risk doing harm no matter how good our intentions. The imperative to act, but to act sensibly, has driven our decision to pursue the mass variations process, which will launch next week, before we undertake a new cycle of access and participation plans next year. We remain committed to those plans running across multiple years, precisely because we know that the work of building durable partnerships and evidence-led interventions takes time. That is why I'm genuinely delighted to be here today, with such an excellent array of speakers sharing their experiences with us. This is testament to the work already being undertaken, and both their willingness to share it and that such a large audience here and online has come to listen shows that the HE sector is ready to play its part in this work. We know this work will be demanding. It will require schools and higher education providers to have challenging conversations about what is needed and who best can deliver that. Work will need to be prioritised to match resources in a post-COVID world. It will require us to admit that some interventions are less effective than others, even where that does not align with our preferences. But it is our duty to get this right, not just for the sake of compliance with regulations, but because fair access to the engines of real social mobility is the foundation of all our future, where leadership of our society to tackle the profound and pressing problems requires diversity of thought, experience, skills, and leadership. Today we are here to foster and expand a united education sector, schools, colleges, and universities, to play its essential role in that work. Thank you. Thank you. I'd now like to invite Greg Burke up to the stage. And segue across to our one-show part of the day. This is, hello audience. This is Greg Burke, Director of Place and Civic Engagement at Sheffield Hallam University. And we've chosen to set this up so we can have a very casual conversation in front of 120 people sitting on a stage. But I wanted to start this by just asking you to talk about the partnership, and why it was established, and what you feel you've learned from it, and what might be useful for other people to understand about it.
Okay, thanks, John. So South Yorkshire Futures programme, which I've been leading at Sheffield Hallam, came out of the redevelopment of our university strategy about 5 years ago. And we produced a strategy called Transforming Lives. And what was really ambitious, I think, in that strategy was improving attainment and progression of young people in South Yorkshire was one of the objectives actually set out in that strategy. And I think that was quite unique in terms of a university being so upfront and explicit that this was something we felt was part of our role as a university. What was interesting, though, was we didn't actually know what we were going to do. So we sort of put our head above the parapet and said, we think we should be doing something. We recognised there was a need, but we didn't actually have a plan of what there was going to be. And I think in hindsight, one of the lessons was that was a really good thing, that we didn't have a list of things we were going to go out and do, an agenda. So what we did was we had lots of very open conversations with partners. We talked to lots of different people. And from that, we gathered, what were the issues, what were the problems, and also where did people feel that the university could really add value. And I think what that led to was us doing very different things from the things we might have done if we had just sat in our room and come up with a list of things that we thought we could do. And just a few examples just to sort of give you a sense of how diverse that led to. We got very involved with the early years space, and we'd always thought that early years was important, but probably when we started, we wouldn't necessarily have expected that to be a huge focus of our work. But actually, over the last 5 years, we've done a massive amount of work in the early years space, recognising that so much of the disadvantage starts preschool. And that's led us to open a research nursery in a deprived community in Sheffield in partnership with the school. We've also worked really closely with the Children's University, and this was an example of where brilliant things were happening, really good evidence that those kids who got involved with the Children's University did much better when they were doing those activities. People with passion, with vision, but just didn't have the capacity to drive it forward. So what we did there was we got behind them, we put some money into it, and we really boosted and helped them with their vision. So I would really encourage people to think about open conversations. Don't go in with this is what universities can do, but go in asking people what are the problems, what are the issues, so that you can then think about what are the things you have that you can bring to the table that might respond to that. And I think one of the things we've been surprised at is there have been very few things that people have come up with and said, we'd really like some help with this. And we've gone away and thought, Actually, as a university, we can't do that. We've been really surprised at the skill set, the resources, the things that we can bring to the table that actually has added a huge amount of value. And one of the things that perhaps has been very key to a lot of the work that we've done, which again, we wouldn't necessarily have realised, is we can often be an honest broker. So one of the things that we've done very successfully is bringing together our 4 local authorities to do quite a range of different projects. And we have been there, the convener, the project manager, bringing things together in a way that the 4 local authorities actually couldn't do themselves because there was difficulty in competition between them. But actually they were very happy to come around a table that we convened. So be creative. Think about all the different things that are possible. Don't go into this idea with this is what universities can do in the attainment space. There are a whole plethora of things that we can do that are really effective.
Thanks, Craig. I'll just say, in a moment, I'll turn to questions from the audience, but just a couple from me, because it's my event and I get to do that. So first of all, I mean, I'm told there is a rumour that there is another university in Sheffield. How involved or not is Sheffield Hallam with the University of Sheffield? What's that interaction like? So you talk about the honest brokering between the local authorities. How does that work with other HE institutions and other FE institutions as well?
So South Yorkshire Futures programme is very much a Sheffield Hallam programme. It's run through Sheffield Hallam governance and is absolutely our programme. But one of the things we've absolutely been conscious of is there are lots of other things happening, and obviously there is the long-lasting partnership with the University of Sheffield around UniConnect. So we've been absolutely not trying to create any sense of this is in competition. We try and make sure it sits alongside those other things that are happening within the city.
And one of the things that I'm very interested in the work that we're doing is to identify what doesn't work as much as what does and why. So could you just talk about, what were the things that you thought might work but turned out not to, and how did you know and what did you do about that?
I think the thing that perhaps has worked least well of the things that we got a bit caught up in the early days. So quite a few of the conversations we had with people were along the lines of, you're a university, you must have lots of money, or you might have access to lots of money. And I think when we were sort of exploring what could we do, what could we not do, we got a bit caught up in, well, we must be able to raise money for all these projects. And actually for us as a university, and this may not be the case, I recognise different universities, and this is an important point, we have different skills, and this is why I think one solution doesn't fit all. We weren't very good at raising money. So actually, the things we got involved in where actually what the organisation wanted us to do was primarily be a way of accessing funding, that just wasn't our skill set. So we now don't get involved in things where the primary objective is about raising funds. There are lots of other people who are much better at that than we are. So we've learnt the things that are, we've been very good at sort of trying things out, not getting too involved before we thought, that's not the thing. So there is something about how do you triage your activities so that you get involved in things that are right for you as an institution and not get sucked into things that actually are going to be quite unhelpful, and you're not going to be the best person. You're not always the best person to do things.
Thank you. And just a final question from me. You talked there about the different skills of different universities, but there's also different places in which universities are found. How does the geography of South Yorkshire affect the sort of work that you do and how you think about it?
I suppose it very much affected why it was in our strategy in the beginning, because we are very much a university of place. We are based in South Yorkshire, and about 40% of our students come from the locality. So therefore, the attainment of people in South Yorkshire is directly affecting our population. And I think that does affect how we operate. I think also as a university, we have different skills from other universities, and therefore, and the context of place, what's happening around things like I mentioned, we did a lot in convening our 4 local authorities. That was very much based on the context of our place. That would not necessarily be something that was appropriate to do in other places. So there is something really important about the context in which you operate as a university.
That's fantastic, thank you. So now I'd like to open the floor to questions from the audience. So if you are online, you can type your question, and then we'll come to the gallery at some point, but I'll start in the room, if I can. We have one here. Thank you very much, Alice.
Hello, thank you very much. Very interesting. One thing I was particularly interested in was when you were talking about how you triage activities, both in terms of what you do, who should do it, but also then you talked at the beginning about linking back to your strategy, how much those strategic objectives then were tied into that triaging process. Perhaps you could talk us through a little bit more about that. I think that would be very helpful.
Yeah, of course. So one of the things I think is really important is attainment is a very big aim. And, you know, in our strategy, we said we wanted to improve attainment levels in South Yorkshire. I think it is important as a university to be clear what we think our contribution is to that. So I think it's just too broad to say we want to improve attainment. We need to work out what are the sort of building blocks of that. Who's doing different things? I mean, John's already mentioned, you know, some of the things that schools clearly lead on. So working out where can we make a difference, and therefore once we're clear, actually this is the thing we want to work on, these are our priorities, then it's easier to triage the things that come in, because if they don't fit with the thing that we think we can really contribute to, then it probably isn't necessarily the thing that we should be working on. The other thing that I think has been a bit of a luxury in a way in my role is you don't have to work with everyone. And I think for me that's been quite an interesting opportunity compared with other jobs that I've done where I've had to work with people and make it work. So one of the things that we do in triaging is we get a bit of a sense from our initial discussions with someone. You know, have we got shared values? Are we on the same page? Is this person or group actually going to do stuff? And if we initially think, you know, this is really going to be hard work and this is going to be like pushing a boulder up a hill, then we just don't go forward with that relationship, because we've got so many opportunities that you need to go with the opportunities where people want to work with you. And I think in this space, there are so many different partners and so many opportunities. Go with the people who are energetic, are going to put commitment to it and make it happen. Don't go with people who are really going to be hard work, because it just isn't going to give you the value that you need.
And did you find that the number of opportunities expanded the more you did? Or so is there now more than there was when you started?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, a note of caution. I think when we started, we probably went out thinking people might be quite resistant, might sort of say, you know, attainment in the school system, nothing to do with you. Absolutely not. So people welcomed us. And I think that was because we were going in saying, we want to have an open conversation. If we'd been going in saying, this is what we plan to do, I think we might have got a different response. So the response to us getting involved as an institution was overwhelming. So actually, there's no lack of appetite for partners, for schools, whoever, you know, whether it be local authorities. People are desperately keen for us as a university to get involved with their projects. So.
Brilliant, thank you. Any further questions? Down here.
Hi, Ruth from Specialist Evidence Evaluation and Research Service. So I'm going to ask an evaluation question. I'm interested, obviously you're looking at raising attainment across a very wide area, a number of different projects. What is your approach to evaluating that?
So I think it goes back to my earlier point about being very careful not to try and evaluate that top level attainment, because it's just the link between what we're doing and that top level is too great, really. So what we've been doing is having a very clear theory of change about the sort of overall outcomes that we're trying to achieve, but being very clear what are the outcomes that we're trying to deliver as opposed to the top level attainment figure. So what we're trying to evaluate is, have we done the thing we wanted to do? A good example, perhaps, to sort of emphasise the point is, one of the things we identified quite early on was a problem with recruitment and retention of teachers in South Yorkshire. Now, we are a very big supplier of teacher training in the region. But what we'd never done before was think about where were our students going when they graduated. So we knew where they were going from a sort of job outcome point of view, but not which bit of the region, did they stay in the region, did they go into the schools that were in shortage. So what we did was we created a project with the other training providers, including the University of Sheffield, who were local, so that we started to, so our objective there was filling vacancies and retaining teachers in schools, and then we had a project around how could we improve that, and we were evaluating to what extent did we achieve the outcome of getting more teachers to go into jobs in South Yorkshire, and particularly in those schools that were difficult to recruit. So we've been sort of thinking very much about what are the building blocks, and we've tried to evaluate the building blocks rather than trying to make the link between our activity and that top level attainment, which is just almost impossible to link, really. So, but evaluation is really important.
And I should say, as part of the work that we're doing, developing the next round of access and participation plans, that principle will be, I think, a strong part of it. One further question from in here, and then I'll go to the gallery.
Hi, Tom Stevenson from Uplearn. As far as I'm aware, there is another project between the University of Sheffield and Sheffield Hallam called HEPSI, the Higher Education Progression Partnership of South Yorkshire. And their goal of raising attainment is far more focused on Key Stage 5 rather than early years. Do you work together with that second partnership, or are they separate entities? And is it the case that one is focusing on early years and one is focusing on another? I'm just interested to see how those two separate partnerships were formed rather than a consolidated one, and what role they play within the overall objectives of raising attainment.
So the partnership that you referred to is actually the UniConnect partnership that's funded through OFS. We work very closely together. In fact, one of my team members is half with that project and half with mine. So we do connect up all the time. I think we complement one another, but I think their focus has probably been a little bit less on attainment and more on progression over the last few years. But obviously that will change as we go into the next phase of development. But yeah, we do work very closely together.
Thank you. Ruby and Jenny are, I think, in the gallery with any questions from online.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got quite a few questions up here, so I'm just going to read a few out. What type of resource does Sheffield Hallam employ to deliver against this? Is there a team? Does it include a senior management? And do Sheffield Hallam students get involved or benefit from the activity?
Okay. Should we? Have you got a few, Ruby?
Yeah,
should we
sure.
take three, and then we'll?
Yeah, sure.
You just have to write them down.
And the second question: have you got any specific examples, evidence of how your work, or the mechanisms behind this work, are raising attainment? And a third question is, would be interested to hear from Greg about whether in their initial conversations with schools, partners, councils, whether Sheffield Hallam experienced any sense of schools, councils feeling that they weren't having things done to them, a worry about short-term projects, particularly given in certain areas of the country where there is less progression to HE and there's already a lot of work taking place.
Shall I start with the last question?
Yeah, you take them whichever order you want.
So I think we were quite worried about going into this space, as I say, when we started, because I had thought that schools might say, get off our turf, this is absolutely our space, why are you treading on it? I think that could have been the case if I think we'd gone in and said, this is what we're planning to do, and it completely overlapped with what they were doing. I think the way we handled it, which was to go in and say, we really want to be involved in this, we want to work with you, what is it that would be useful if we did? I think that helped us to navigate through this. So I've not had one conversation with any school where they have been at all antagonistic to what we're trying to do. So we've been welcomed with open arms, but I think that is to do with the way we set up the conversation. On the point about evaluation, I think it sort of, in a way, refers back to the question I just answered. What we've been trying to do is evaluate the projects within our overall programme. So we are evaluating at a level at which we can see that we've been trying to do something and our project has successfully done that. And what we're doing there, I mean, I made the reference to the teacher recruitment, but this will be true of other things as well. I mean, the work we're doing with the Children's University, we're very much building on the evidence that if you have a children's university in place, children do extracurricular activity, there's good research around, evidence around, particularly coming through the EF, that does lead to improved attainment and improved outcomes for young people. So what we're trying to do is very much build on evidence that exists, which says if you improve this part of the system, then attainment will flow from that. So that's really where we're very much doing something and evidencing that that thing we're trying to do is happening on the basis that somebody else usually has already evidenced that that piece of the jigsaw makes a difference. On the question about resource, so we did this in a very particular way, and I think it has worked really well. It might not, it might not have worked. So I think some of the things here that are really important, the fact that it's in the university strategy is absolutely vital. So the board of governors, the vice-chancellor, everybody is absolutely signed up to it. So when I have been trying to do things or get resource, or I've never hit a brick wall, because basically this is something the university does. Now, I wouldn't underestimate how important that is. Having that senior sign up that attainment is something as a university you're about, to me, is very important. I have a very small team of only sort of, about 4 people who actually do the sort of pulling together, the coordination. I think that is important, and I think it's important because it's enabled us to have a programme, it's enabled us to have governance, it's enabled us to really keep track of what we're doing. I think if we'd not had that small team, it would have been very easy for us just to have got lost somewhere. But the idea of the way we work is we are a sort of gateway to the wider university. So we as a team don't deliver many of the things we're doing. What we do is we have the connection, we enable people in the outside world to connect through our team, and then we facilitate that engagement with other bits of the university, including the student body, who might then get involved in actually delivering or working on the particular project. So we're a sort of a gateway into the wider resources of the university.
Thank you. Further questions in the room? Down here.
I'm a principal of an independent higher education institution, Icon College of Technology Management in East London. Now, my first question is, whether Sheffield Hallam signed the partnership agreement with the school. Second question is, whether Sheffield Hallam allow the school children to visit the facilities of just like computing, library, and other resources inside the Sheffield Hallam University.
So the way we've worked so far is at a much more system level, really, rather than having lots of, within South Yorkshire Futures, obviously the university, we have lots of different partnerships with schools. So we haven't focused on building lots of individual partnerships with schools. The one exception of that is the one that I mentioned, where we have a very specific partnership with the school, where we're running a nursery in partnership with them, and that is an absolute sort of formal partnership. What I think we'll be doing as we go into the next phase of the programme is starting to work with some more individual multi-academy trusts or individual schools, where I think we will get more into that space, where what we're starting to say is, okay, you've got some particular problems, particular issues. Could we work with you on trying to tackle it? It might be a particular school within an academy trust, or it might be a particular challenge that they're facing. So I think the next phase might get us more into that space, but it hasn't been, we've been operating a bit more at the sort of system level, really.
Thank you. Further questions in the hall? In which case we'll go back to the gallery. Anything else, Ruby?
Hello, yeah, we've got quite a few actually.
Yeah, okay, well, should we go for another round of 3?
I'll try and make sure they're a bit shorter this time. Okay, first of all, were there any specific findings related to underrepresented groups, assume as defined with an access and participation plan, as some of this is captured through the access and widening participation initiatives of various HE institutions? Second question, does Sheffield Hallam work with pupil referral units as part of SYN? And final question, Do you anticipate small and specialist providers being disadvantaged in their ability to forge partnerships with schools to the level anticipated by the OFS? Because schools may prefer to link up with larger institutions with access to greater resources and finances. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Ruby. That last question, very much a point with a question on it. I'll come back to that. But do you want to answer the other two? And then?
Yeah, okay. So we found some very interesting things, I think, as we did analysis of the sort of what made up South Yorkshire and different sort of aspects of the population. I think that the statistic perhaps that really stood out, which we hadn't really realised before perhaps, was those children who really attain well don't go on to get into the most highly selective universities or go on to get the top jobs. So that was quite an interesting thing that was perhaps a bit under the radar, because schools were of the view that, you know, they weren't problem kids, they were doing really well. But actually, when you looked at them and compared them with other, and this is perhaps something we were a bit more able to do, looking at a whole group of data, that actually when you compared them with other parts of the country, they weren't doing as well as they could. So that was quite an interesting aspect. I think most of the other things were probably more, as you might expect, those sort of things to fall out, really. Pupil referral units, really good question. We are very happy to work across the age range, across any organisation. So we've had quite a lot of discussions with pupil referral units. It hasn't as yet led to a specific project, but it probably kicked off some quite interesting work around special educational needs, where we are starting to think about what might excellent special educational needs, particularly in a post-16 world, look like for South Yorkshire. So it's quite interesting how one conversation can often lead to something else that's slightly different from the conversation that we started. But we're very open to do projects with pupil referral units. We just haven't come up with something specific yet. And the last question, John, you...
I think it's probably for me.
Yeah.
I think one of the things I think that's so important in what Greg said is that the shape and form of these things has to be influenced by what the provider is able to do, the partnerships they're building, the partners they're partnering with, and the geography and all the meanings of that word that they're operating within. And I think small and specialist providers have a huge amount to offer, given their specialism. But we are also thinking through how we ensure that the demands we place on providers are proportionate to their capacity to actually make that difference. So I think there's a mix that I think, I think we've been very clear that what Greg's talking about here, there are some providers I think who could do a lot very similarly. There are some who want to do things very differently, and we are very, very much not in the business of saying you must do X or you must do Y. It needs to match your particular need. But also trying to ensure that isn't an unfair burden on those providers who have less capacity because of their size. So that will be part of the consultation as we go. I'll take three more from the gallery, and then we'll see if there's any more in the room.
So we've actually got two, if that's okay. So the first question is, did you approach schools and academies individually or through groups? E.g. MATs, LA maintained schools, and how did you get in to speak with senior leaders? And the second question, how did you identify who you would approach for your initial open conversation? Was a particular criteria applied? And that's the questions from us.
Thank you.
So the first question, it's been very sort of evolving, I suppose, in a way. We didn't necessarily set out with a list of people we were going to talk to and work through them in a sort of a rigid way. Because we are a very big provider of teacher education, we have a lot of relationships with schools individually or with multi-academy trust chief execs, etc. So actually it was fairly easy for us to have those conversations because we had those sort of natural relationships in place. And so that was fairly easy to kick off. As I say, some of them went somewhere, some of them didn't go anywhere. And I think that's actually absolutely fine. I think it's okay to have a conversation and then realise that isn't quite the right moment for them, or what they want to do isn't quite going to work. And you can move on to the next thing. And I don't think you need to flog things that are not necessarily going to go there. The second question was about approach.
About approaching senior leaders and getting the buy-in from senior leaders in the schools.
Yeah,
I think.
Which I think, again, is probably sort of the same answer in a way, which is we did have a lot of those existing relationships in the school sector. We did have access to the chief execs of our local academies. It wasn't difficult really to have those conversations. And as I say, people were very happy to meet, very happy to have that very open conversation. And I think people were very welcoming that, it was something they were delighted that we wanted to get into this space. They were very happy to have the meeting, very keen to have a conversation. So it was never, I don't think there was one person who ever said, I don't want to meet you, or I'm not interested in having that conversation. It was actually very, but as I say, a lot of that was built on existing very good relationships that we had because of the teacher education work that we do, which obviously not every institution would have those same links with schools necessarily.
Can I follow up on a couple of points that you've raised there? So the first one is about the education departments and whether, but presumably the work within the university goes well beyond the education department. So, I mean, could you just describe sort of what the education departments do, but what other bits of the university are doing as well?
Yeah, so I mean, I suppose a very good example is the nursery that I've mentioned is a really cross-university project, because we actually run the nursery through our professional services bit of the university. We've combined it with our staff nursery. We run it through professional services, but the academic input to it is very much coming through the teacher education department. So what we look at is, what is the project? What is the thing we're trying to do? And where across the university can we bring those resources to make it happen, really? And I think that's where having a sort of central team has really helped to bridge across different departments, which it would be quite difficult for the outside world to come into the university and navigate that wiring. So in a way, that's where I think having a small team is very helpful.
Okay. And I just wanted to follow up also on the point about, so you had very positive responses from people when you approached them, but one of the concerns in the school system is a turnover of staff. Have you had difficulties maintaining those partnerships if there's been staff turnover, and what's the nature of the framework that holds this together? Is it just sort of goodwill, or is there something more solid?
I think that probably goes back to my point about be careful how you establish the people you're going to work with, because I think if you are trying to work with an organisation, whether it be a school, a multi-academy trust, don't rely on the goodwill of one person. So I think you have to connect in a very joined up way, and so if it is very dependent on the goodwill of that person's really keen, but you're not picking up the organisation is, that would be giving me alarm bells, because it won't work, because when that person moves on, it will all fall apart. So what we've done is very much established relationships between organisations, with obviously people are key to that, but it's not a one-person relationship, because I just don't think that gives you the sustainability that you need.
Okay. I'm receiving flashcard warnings that time is nearly up, and I have one more question, but I'll just ask the room if there's anyone else who wants to... Oh, go on. You have to be quick. Two over here. Can we have both of those?
Thank you. Ashley from Guildhall School of Music and Drama. Is a suggestion that this type of really broad civic work is going to become part of APPs, or that APPs are a small part of the broader civic work? I'm just a little bit concerned that outlining civic commitments within an APP commits already quite stretched teams, and that might limit what is possible.
Should we have the other question then? I think that's probably for me. I won't make you answer that.
Hi, Alex Blower from Arch University, Bournemouth. It was similar but different, I guess. I was really interested in, within the wider civic commitment of the institution that covers, a great deal of things that lead to socio-economic challenges within a region, how significant the attainment piece was within that. Like, it sounds like a very, very important strand, and I was just interested in the balance across the institution with regards to the relevance.
Okay, that one is for you,
Yeah,
Bill. If I just do my one very quickly, I think this is a really important part of the civic work, and I think more of it can be included in APPs, but it's not the totality of all of that work. One of the reasons for pursuing the mass variations process is in part to work out where that balance lies, and there is definitely work that is going on at the moment that providers are not getting any credit for because there's no way of recording it, but clearly the APPs are already very lengthy, which is why we're introducing the summary. So expanding them outwards to sort of Lord of the Rings length isn't going to help. So it's sort of working out what the balance is there. But.
Yeah, so another part of my job is to lead the Civic University Network and the sort of Civic University agreement space. I think for us as a university, we see those two things as absolutely interconnected. So I work very closely with my colleagues who lead on the APP to make sure that what we're putting in our Civic University agreement, what we're doing under our Civic University, absolutely fits with the APP. So we see them absolutely working together. But obviously that's very much how we're working as an institution. Different institutions may have a very different approach to civic, and therefore I think it does have to be a little bit, what I've described is probably quite broad, and that fits well with, because we are taking quite a broad approach to civic, but other institutions may have a slightly different way of cutting up the way you do your different activities. So, yeah.
Okay, just before we close, my final question, I think, is we've talked a lot about what the university, what Sheffield Hallam is doing for the partnerships and doing that work. What's the benefit to Sheffield Hallam of doing this work? Is it just purely altruistic, or is there what is the university getting back from this, do you think?
So one of the things that's been very positive is getting involved with more local projects. Provides really great opportunities for our students. So we've had some really good examples of where our students have been able to get involved in projects that have been credit bearing. We've been able to integrate them into their courses. I think it also gives our students that sense of belonging is quite important. So actually being involved in things that are good for the community, whether they be educational or wider things, that is quite a positive thing that students like that. They feel like they're giving something back. It's quite a positive message for them as well. I think we've got a lot more to do on that. It's something we're at quite an early stage of what does that look, how does this feed back into the student offer?
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Greg. If I can invite the audience to thank Greg in the traditional way. Thank you very much. If you can make me all done. Hi, it's me again. This is the last bit of me for a while. So thanks very much to Greg for that. I think that was a fascinating and sort of really important sort of chance to think about the way in which one particular institution has set about doing that. For our next speaker, I'm absolutely delighted that we will be hosting Amanda Spielman, who is Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Schools and the head of Ofsted. I think one of the things that higher education providers have said to me a lot about this is that they're very willing to, many of them are very willing to undertake this work, but they are not sure what the attitude of schools is and whether or not schools are being positively encouraged to engage with this kind of work. And we were very pleased to see explicit endorsement of the work and approach in the government's recent schools white paper. But I'm also very happy that Amanda is here to share the perspective of the school inspectorate on those issues and how schools and HE can work well together. So, Amanda.
Thank you very much, John. Good morning, and thank you so much for inviting me along to this event. It's spring and we're well into conference and event season, and so happily in person, not just online. John, I'm going to correct you slightly on one small point because I think it's relevant, particularly in the light of what we heard from Greg, that we are the inspectorate. I am the Chief Inspector of Education, Children's Services and Skills. Our interest in education sort of starts at birth and goes through into adult education and apprenticeships. So we bring a wider context than just what happens in schools. But coming back, of course, the pandemic is still looming large over everything that we do. Right across education, from early years to universities, there are issues to address. Staffing, attendance, physical and mental health, learning loss, those are the most obvious. But of course, there are other challenges that educators at every level are having to rise to. I recently spoke at a schools conference about the need to restore confidence. And I talked about the role that schools can play in doing that. And I think that theme fits well with the discussion today, because taking the decision to pursue education beyond age 18 does take confidence. It's the confidence to defer employment and to make an investment in oneself. It's confidence that the extra years of learning will pay off in the long run. At Ofsted, most of our post-16 work is about FE colleges and apprenticeships rather than higher education. And in further education, there's a more linear relationship between learning and employment. Whereas higher education often asks for a bigger leap of faith. It demands an appreciation that learning is its own reward, alongside a confidence that there will be jam tomorrow. We're asking school leavers, school and college leavers, to back themselves, and we're asking them to do it after 2 years of uncertainty and disruption. So that's how I see the context for today's event, how universities, schools and colleges can work together to give young people the confidence that a university education could be right for them and right for now. A big part of that will always sit with schools and colleges themselves. They need to set a culture that values learning, and one that sees the accumulation of qualifications as the natural byproduct of a rounded education, rather than an end in itself. When I became Chief Inspector in 2017, I wanted to make sure that the inspection regime really championed education. That may sound a little odd, but we've never expected more of our schools and colleges than we do now. They're expected to handle so much more than academic education as society evolves and sometimes as support services are withdrawn. They also have a vital role to play in safeguarding. This was exposed during the first lockdown when referrals to social services dropped dramatically as children just slipped out of sight of teachers. We expect schools to do more for children with complex needs as support services have diminished, and they're under so much pressure to ameliorate a whole raft of social issues, from childhood obesity to poverty to mental health. And schools and colleges, like universities, have to tread a careful path through the whole landscape of equalities and rights, and on the one hand being damned for being intolerant, or on the other being slammed for being woke. We want schools to encourage children to become engaged citizens without tipping over the line of impartiality. There are just so many expectations on our schools and colleges. And that's why I think it's so important to encourage and reward them for maintaining a clear-eyed focus on education. And that's why our inspection framework puts the greatest emphasis on the curriculum, on the substance of education. We want to know how they're structuring it. We want to be assured that they're teaching to build knowledge over time and to encourage a greater understanding of the subject matter, not just teaching to the test. And I've spoken a number of times about what I see as the purposes of education: broadening minds, enriching communities, advancing civilization. Fundamentally, education should help us leave the world a better place than we found it. And that all starts at school, and it starts with the curriculum. That's why we're putting significant emphasis on our curriculum research reviews as an important foundation for inspection, but also to contribute to a better understanding of what makes a good curriculum. In the wake of COVID and the learning gaps that so many young people have, it's not good enough to cover the same ground at twice the speed. That won't help these young people as they develop, and it won't help universities as you take on the next generation of students. These young people's experience of education needs to give them the groundwork to move to a higher level. I think it's worth mentioning that the area where we look directly at what happens in higher education is in the way that we prepare the teachers of the future. Our new framework for inspecting initial teacher training aligns with our inspection framework for schools and for colleges, and also with the initial teacher training core content framework and early career framework. These structures all need to be coherent if we are to provide high quality and consistent education and training and development for teachers. If we want curriculum-focused teachers, that begins with what they themselves learn. But as ever, it's about getting pathways right. Schools and colleges have a duty to provide career guidance for their pupils, but of course, that shouldn't start and end with job roles. We want to see them discussing the right pathways to help children and young people get to where they want to be. And of course, that includes discussions about further and higher education. And for our part, we've become more explicit about what we expect to see to prepare young people for future opportunities. Our curriculum focus in the school's handbook is rooted in the knowledge and skills that pupils need in order to take advantage of opportunities, responsibilities, and experiences of later life. This approach helps to address social disadvantage, and our implied hope is that schools will provide a broad subject base and not narrow the curriculum. You all know too well that it's too easy for young people to set limited horizons for themselves when choosing what to study at university if they haven't had a broad enough education at school. And that directly affects your ability to provide a broad range of study. So in schools and colleges, we look at every stage at how young people are being prepared for the next stage of education or training or employment. And we want to see that sixth formers and college students are ready to move on to appropriate high-quality destinations. There is rightly a great deal of political interest in the application of the Baker Clause. The skills agenda, links to employment, and the benefits for the economy are putting a renewed emphasis on vocational education. But we mustn't discourage schools from applying just as much effort to pathways into higher education. For those whose talents and aspirations would set them up well for a university education, we want to see the right encouragement. So in our framework, where we talk about careers information, education, advice and guidance, we reference the Gatsby benchmarks, which are now baked into the Department for Education's statutory guidance for careers education. For today's event, of course, we're particularly interested in the 7th benchmark. It's presented for schools in quite a prescriptive way. It stipulates that by age 16, every student should have had a meaningful encounter with providers of the full range, with providers of the full range of educational opportunities. And by age 18, students thinking of going to university should have had at least 2 visits to institutions. The guidance defines a meaningful encounter as an opportunity to explore what it's like to learn in that environment. So the guidance it's both a blunt instrument and a bit vague. Every pupil should have 1 meaningful encounter by age 16, but the nature of that encounter is open to interpretation. And the desire to reach potential students is clearly fueling some big and expensive outreach programs. And I don't say that to be critical, but rather to emphasize that the efforts that universities make need to be effective because they really don't come cheap. And there's still a lot to do to make them as effective as we all hope and want. Now, there is a lot that schools and colleges can do to demystify higher education for those who don't have a family background of higher education or who don't socialise in a peer group that sees university as a natural progression. I'm sure your discussions today will touch on that. I completely understand how difficult it must be to map the best linkages between universities, schools and colleges. Sometimes, as Greg has talked about, there's an obvious local pipeline of young people who are interested in staying in their local area and going to a local or relatively local university. That gives a clear focus for university marketing and provides a catchment area to work with. And staying local does seem to have been a growing trend over the years. It'll be fascinating to see what happens in the near future with the impact of the pandemic on the way that potential students view university. I know that UCAS surveys and other anecdotal evidence suggests that restrictions have made quite a lot of uncertainty about studying away from home, and that this seems to be accelerating a trend to apply to local institutions. And even with restrictions lifted, more significance may be being given to financial considerations, especially with current economic uncertainties and the threat of high inflation. But of course, many young people will continue to go away to residential universities. A move away from parents and home comforts has always been framed as a step into a more adult world of greater responsibility and freedom. But individual financial concerns could still drive a more utilitarian view of higher education. The social aspects of university and the opportunity to study a subject in greater depth may take second place to considerations about employability at the end of a course, which could affect the popularity of different courses, as well as the popularity of different institutions. So as you develop relationships and work to provide young people with those meaningful encounters, you will no doubt want to consider how you can best frame the benefits of your courses, the support you provide to students, and the future prospects of your graduates. If you're a university looking to entice more locally based students, it's obviously somewhat easier to work with existing partnerships such as multi-academy trusts. The growth of trusts has been the big transformative change for schooling over the last decade, and the Education White Paper makes clear that the direction of travel is more and bigger trusts in future, overseeing all or nearly all schools. And a number of universities are already closely involved with MATs. But the higher education doesn't need to take a hands-on role in running schools to build relationships with MATs, and a relationship with a trust does give you the chance to work with dozens of schools at a time. But of course, if you work for an institution that enjoys a national catchment, your efforts will naturally be dispersed more widely. And this is where the bluntness of the guidance comes into focus. Providing meaningful encounters, especially in person, is both difficult and expensive. But of course, there are a number of organisations with growing expertise in helping universities and schools and colleges manage this well. Some of you are here today. I've seen some of you exhibiting in the next door room before we started. And technology may provide part of the answer here. More universities are embracing virtual visits. But still, this generation of students will have its eyes on an end goal as much as on the experience they enjoy on the way. So the links with schools and colleges will be vital in understanding pupils' thoughts about higher education as a viable alternative to on-the-job training or vocational study. And for our part, we will carry on stressing the importance of a broadly based, well-structured curriculum to encourage real learning, not just exam preparation. We'll continue to expect schools and colleges to set out a range of pathways for their students, including higher education. And we will want schools to think about how they can give their students the meaningful encounters with higher education that will bring them into closer partnership with universities. I wish you every success with that work, and I hope you enjoy the rest of today's event. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. I think it's incredibly valuable reminders of the diversity of work that can be done by HE providers and the importance of the third sector, but in particular also fantastic to hear those messages going out to our colleagues in the school sector. It is now time for a break. I am to remind you that our restart time is 11:35, and in keeping with our school theme, a bell will ring to remind you to come back in here. So great. Fantastic. See you all soon. Bye-bye.